Hello, my name is Matthew Genslinger, and I am the pastor of the new Church of Concord. And this is my weekly reading of the text of the sermon that I gave this last Sunday. Now, just as a quick reminder, obviously hearing a sermon read online is not nearly the same as being here in church in person on a Sunday morning. However, my hope in doing this is that I will be able to give just a few more people access to some of the spiritual food and drink that we are working hard to provide for people here at the new Church of Concord. Now, this week I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I am going to also be reading for you the lessons that were provided on Sunday morning. They're a bit long, but my thought is that there might be some people who would actually enjoy hearing these read. And if you don't have time for this, you can always just skip ahead in the video to the spot where the actual sermon begins. So, this week's sermon was on the wonderful story of the Lord turning water into wine. And the first lesson was from the Gospel of John, chapter 2. Now, on the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus and his disciples were called to the wedding. Now, when the wine was lacking, the mother of Jesus said to Jesus, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "What is it to me and to you, woman? My hour is not yet come." And so his mother said to those ministering, "Whatever he shall say to you, do it." Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the purification of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 measures apiece. And Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." And they filled them up to the top. And he said to them, "Draw out now, and bring to the chief of the feast." And they brought it. Now when the chief of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, the chief of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man first lays out the good wine, and when they are drunken, then the lesser. You have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. At this point in the service, we offered a wonderful children's talk for the kids about this miracle of the Lord turning water into wine. After the children's talk, there was then the second lesson for the adults from the book of Revelation, chapter 21, part of the description of the holy city that John saw descending from God out of heaven. And the city is laid 4-cornered, and her length is as much as the breadth. And he measured the city with the reed, 12,000 stadia. The length and the breadth and the height were equal. And he measured her wall 144 cubits, the measure of a man, which is of an angel. And the structure of her wall was jasper, and the city was pure gold like pure glass. And the foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every precious stone. Now, our first reading from the writings for the new church was from the Apocalypse Revealed, number 914. And the foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every precious stone, signifies that all things of the doctrine of the New Jerusalem, taken from the sense of the letter of the word, with those who are therein, will appear in light according to reception. By precious stone is signified the word in the sense of the letter, made translucent from its spiritual sense. And because this is according to reception, therefore it signifies that all things of doctrine from the word with them will appear in light according to reception. All who do not think sanely cannot believe that all things of the new church can appear in light, but let them know that they can. For every person has exterior and interior thought. Interior thought is in the light of heaven and is called perception. And exterior thought is in the light of the world. And the understanding of every person is such that it can be elevated even into the light of heaven, and also is elevated if from any delight he wishes to see truth. For the delight of love and wisdom elevates the thought, enabling one to see as in the light that a thing is so, although he had never heard it before. This light, which enlightens the mind, flows in from no other source than out of heaven from the Lord. And as they who will be of the New Jerusalem will directly approach the Lord, that light will flow in by the way of order, which is through the love of the will, into the perception of the understanding. However, they who have confirmed themselves in that dogma that the understanding in theological things is to see nothing, but that what the church teaches must be believed blindly, cannot see any truth in the light, for they have obstructed the way of the light into themselves. Do therefore, my friend, go to the Lord, and shun evils as sins, and reject faith alone. And then your understanding will be opened, and you will see wonderful things, and be affected by them. And finally, a brief reading from True Christian Religion, number 151. A person's mind consists of understanding and will, and as the understanding deals with thinking and the will with doing, so when a person's acknowledgement is merely from the thought of the understanding, he comes to the Lord with only half of his mind. But when there is doing, he comes with all of it. And this is to believe. Amen. So those were our lessons, and the sermon itself was called Whatever He Says, Do It, Turning Water into Wine. Now when the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then that which is inferior. But you have kept the good wine until now." One of the beautiful transitions every person can make is the transition from a merely external or natural understanding of life, represented in this miracle by the water, to a more internal or spiritual understanding, represented in this story by the wine. Every day, the Lord is working to turn water into wine by opening our hearts and minds to the deeper realities of His heavenly kingdom. He wants to help us see the more spiritual origin of His creation. He wants to help us see the more spiritual and internal aspects of ourselves and of our relationships with others. He wants to help us to see and understand the internal sense of His own word. Now, the wonderful thing about this story of the Lord turning water into wine is that it not only illustrates the Lord's desire to do this, the story also illustrates how this process actually takes place. When there only seems to be water left, when all we have is a very external understanding and perspective, what can we do to allow the Lord to transform our external understanding into a more spiritual one? Now, to begin with, I want to re-emphasize what we talked about with the children, having to do with those wonderful words that Mary spoke. Whatever he shall say to you, do it. In order for any change to take place in our life, one of the first things we need to do is humbly acknowledge that only the Lord has that ability to change us. Yes, we need to cooperate with him, but only he has the divine love, wisdom, and power needed to make such a miraculous transformation. The Lord is the one that performed the miracle of turning water into wine, not the disciples. And it was really only because Mary told the people to do whatever he said that this miracle was able to take place. A very simple teaching, but if we want our minds to be transformed, if we want to move towards a more internal and spiritual understanding of life, we need to start with that age-old question: do we recognize our need for the Lord's help? And whatever he says to us, are we willing to do it? So, what does the Lord tell us to do? Well, the first thing the Lord told the people to do was to fill the water pots with water. And this is an image of our need to actively seek and fill our minds with the Lord's teachings. It's interesting how often in the scriptures we find the Lord encouraging us to be proactive in our consumption of his divine truth. A spiritual understanding is not something that comes to someone who sits back and merely waits for inspiration. A spiritual understanding is in part something that comes to the person who actively strives for it. The very first thing the Lord said to his disciples in the Gospel of John was, "What do you seek?" And in the Sermon on the Mount, after teaching the multitude so many wonderful things, he inspired them to be proactive in their efforts to discover spiritual truth for themselves. He said, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you." Now, one marvelous thing to realize as we think about filling these pots with water is that the Lord doesn't just command us to actively fill our minds with his divine truth. The Lord himself is the one who gives us the affection for doing this. From the time that we are very young, from the time that we are very young children, we find ourselves with this curious affection for learning. We love to learn about the world around us. And more importantly, we begin to develop an affection for the Lord's Word. If given an opportunity, children love learning the rich stories in the Scriptures. And they love asking questions about the Lord, about heavenly marriage, about good and evil, and about the life after death. Well, this very affection or delight we have from the time we're little children for filling up those water pots is a gift that comes from the Lord himself. And it is in part what makes us human. The key is that we need to take it upon ourselves to use this gift by fostering this affection for truth. We cannot let the world around us and our own immersion in other things suffocate this beautiful God-given affection or thirst we do have to eagerly seek out and joyfully fill our minds with as much knowledge and truth from the Lord's word as we can. We can see this willingness on our part to foster this God-given affection for truth, not only in the fact that the people heeded the Lord's command to fill the water pots, but in the fact that they filled them up all the way to the top. Did you notice that detail? That filling of the water pots to the top is symbolic of not just a casual curiosity, but a fervent desire to approach the Lord and learn everything that we can from him. In Psalm 63, we read, "O God, you are my God, and I shall seek you earnestly." In Isaiah, "At night my soul longs for you. Indeed, my spirit within me seeks you diligently." And again in the Sermon on the Mount, we read, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." That's the filling of those water pots with water. Now, after the people had filled the pots to the very top with water, the Lord gave them a second command. He said, "Draw out now and bring to the chief of the feast." Now, on one level, this is an image of the classic and often repeated teaching that it is never enough simply to learn what is true. Once we've learned what is true, we need to draw that truth out by actually living according to it. The passage we read this morning from True Christian Religion expressed this wonderfully by saying that when we simply acknowledge the Lord by thinking about him and his truth, it's like we are approaching the Lord with only half of our mind. But when we take the truth we have gathered and use it to actually do what is good, we are then approaching the Lord with all of our mind. We've filled the water pots, and we are now drawing that water out and taking it to the chief of the feast. But now there's a detail in this story, or in this part of the story, that is often overlooked. Something that can really help us appreciate what exactly it means to use the truth we've gathered to do what is good. And the detail has to do with what kind of pots this water was drawn out of. Do you remember what it was? They were water pots, but more specifically, these were pots used for purification. They were specifically used for washing dishes, for washing hands, and for washing people's dusty feet as they arrived from their travels to the wedding. Now, at first glance, this may seem like an insignificant detail, but there's an extremely important message in this. The message being that if we want to allow the Lord to transform our natural understanding of truth into a spiritual one, more than anything else, we need to draw out the truth that we do know by using it to cleanse ourselves of evil loves and ideas. The heavenly doctrines are very clear in the fact that in order to actually do anything that is good, and in order to even begin to be a spiritual person, our first responsibility is to shun the various things that are preventing us from receiving the Lord's divine love and wisdom into our lives. If we try to take the truth that we know and use it to do what is good before we have shunned evils as sins, the teaching is that the good we think we're doing will not actually be good. Why? Well, because it will end up being tainted by our own evils. The good we do will inevitably come from a selfish motive, rather than from the Lord's divine love within us. This is a little bit of a complex idea, but it is such an important one. Again, the basic teaching, illustrated in these water pots being used for purification, is that the first step we must take if we want to allow the Lord to transform our lives is the step of shunning evils as sins. The cleansing waters of baptism also represent this important role of truth. And interestingly, the fact that there were 6 of these water pots also points to this cleansing nature of truth. 6 being a number in the scriptures that often represents a state of spiritual conflict between good and evil. This is why in Exodus, the Lord said, "For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work." Also referring to our need to use truth, to labor against the evils and false ideas we find within our own hearts and minds. Now, coming back to this image of water being turned into wine, what I find so fascinating about this is the revelation that if we want to allow the Lord to take our external understanding or perspective on life and transform it into an internal and spiritual understanding, we cannot simply gather in more and more truth. Developing a truly spiritual perspective on life and being able to see the more interior truths within the Lord's own word does not happen by simply thinking. It happens by living. It is only as we live within the Lord's order, or within the order of the Lord's divine truth, that the Lord is able to open our minds so that we can receive the very light of heaven. Another beautiful example of this in the scriptures can be seen in the description of the holy city, New Jerusalem, that John saw coming down from heaven, from God. The foundation of this city was in part made out of precious stones. And these precious stones represent something similar to the wine in our story for today. They represent all of the spiritual truths and the spiritual understanding of His Word that the Lord gives to people who will make up His new church. But here again, He also makes the point very clearly that these precious stones, this spiritual understanding of truth, will only come to those who live a life in keeping with His commandments. And explaining how the precious stones that make up the foundation of the holy city represent this higher or more internal understanding of what is true, I love how he concludes. He says, "Do therefore, my friend, go to the Lord and shun evils as sins and reject faith alone. And then your understanding will be opened and you will see wonderful things." And that was from the Arcana, number 914. So this week, reflect on the beautiful image of the Lord turning water into wine. An image of the Lord providing us with a new, more spiritual understanding of his word and the life he continues to bless us with. If we want our minds to be transformed, we need to start by listening to those wise words of Mary. Whatever he shall say to you, do it. And what does the Lord then tell us to do? First, he tells us to fill the water pots with water. Use the affection for truth that the Lord has given us since childhood to seek and explore and to gather in the abundance of living waters that the Lord provides. And second, he tells us to draw out and bring to the chief of the feast. Take his teachings and don't just think about them. Live them. Draw them out and present them to the Lord by using them to shun evils and to live a useful life. If we make the effort to do these two things, we will be amazed at the wonderful things we will see. The Lord will be able to turn water into wine within our own hearts and minds, giving us a new understanding of his word and the life he created us for. Reading from the Gospel of John, and when the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, he said to them, every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then that which is inferior. But you have kept the good wine until now. Amen. So that was the written text of the sermon about this wonderful story of the Lord turning water into wine. Really a story about how the Lord is able to transform our natural or external understanding of life and his word into a new spiritual one. I hope you have a good week.